we finally got our crankcase put together here and closed up. So the next couple videos, we're just going to break down and do some smaller things here. So what we want to do is we just want to basically trim this guy out. I've got here laid out in front of me. So this is basically the remaining remnants of oil fittings and smaller components that are going to go on our case here to basically wrap this guy up before we move on to pistons and cylinders. And then we'll just take a quick look at everything laid out on the bench here. So this is really going to be our next phase of the engine case here. So I'm just working on our piston and piston ring gaps here, measuring everything out, and then setting up and filing all our piston rings, make sure we got those where we want them. All the parts and pieces here are all accounted for. Everything's been reconditioned and ready to assemble. And then having a closer look and see exactly what we have here, some oil fittings, our sump cover and drain plug, and our ramps here. These guys here have just driven me crazy. So I haven't had much luck with the new style plastic ramps from Porsche. Compared to the originals, which I'll take a look here in a second, I've had some issues with some breaking of the clips, and that's something we really want to talk about and try to get sorted out before we put it in the engine and seal off on it. If we break one of those tabs, which is these little guys right down here, right down there, you break one of those tabs off inside your engine, it can be in a lot of pain down the road. So something we want to pay attention to and see what we can do to install them to avoid any problems. And then the other thing we want to talk about here as we roll through the parts and pieces and get them installed onto our crankcase is recommended torque specs. So we're working with an aluminum case here. This is an old case and it has been worked on for many years before it got to its final resting spot. If you're working with a magnesium case, magnesium is basically a softer metal than aluminum. So I'm just going to give you some things to think about rather than taking things literally to the torque specs, which you would find online or in a book. Not necessarily out of the manual. You could get yourself into trouble and damage your case or damage something here. So it's really important to pay attention to what you're torquing down, how you're torquing it down, how that relates to the structural integrity of the component or the case, and potential damage that could happen if you over torque something. So one of the things the modern age has brought to us is Loctite. This particular thing here has changed the degree of error quite considerably when you're torquing things down. So if I have my druthers, whether I'm going to torque something down to a higher spec and just oil it, torque it, and let it go, or I can go to a lighter spec using some Loctite, a little bit of forgiveness in there. It's not going to back out. I'm sealed. We're not going to have a problem there. We don't have to worry about warpage or twisting. I'm going to go with a lighter torque spec and using Loctite as a safety net working on these older engines. And then before we get started here, I'm just showing you some scribble that I have here on some various torque specs that I've looked up. And I wouldn't take any of this literally. I'm just showing you what I have and some different ways I've achieved it through the manual, cross-referencing through Wayne's book, looking things up online. And then also I always want to go to anything Kurt Donahue has on Classic Automotive Training School, what he recommends, as he worked with this all the time. And some of these torque specs are just all over the road. Really hard to pick one that's going to work. So we'll talk about each one as we put things together on here, and potentially the hazards of over torquing or under torquing, and hopefully we get it right. All right, so then getting started here, let's start with our oil sump cover and strainer. Do that guy first. Hopefully there won't be too many issues to worry about there. And then after that, we'll move on to our chain ramps and bolts here, talk about those and the issues I'm having with the breaking plastic tabs. So I think we'll just stick with those two for this video. There's a lot to talk about just with those two small things. And then on the second part, we'll go ahead and wrap it up by installing the remaining bits and pieces. Okay, so getting started on this area first, I have cleaned all my mating surfaces really good with denatured alcohol. These studs here are handmade studs that I have made and replaced the originals. The originals were just torn to pieces, a little bit bent as a result of over torquing. And I've also made these just a slightly bit longer than the stock ones to take up for a newer style nylock and washer. I think a nylock really is just a better nut. Even though I like to be as original as possible, I just think we're going to get better service life out of the nylocks. So we're going to start by installing our first gasket. And then sliding our strainer case. Making sure it's seated. And then our other gasket. Okay, so we want to be opposite to this guy. We want to be in here with our drain plug, like so. And then our M6 nylocks. Now my threads already have a little bit of oil on them. And these are a real light torque spec, so no need to special lubricants on them. All right, so we're just nutting it down there. Let's take a look and see what we got. So we got some interesting things happening. So all these studs were set at the same distance when I put them in there, and they were just hand threaded in. But the nylock is actually taking some grip on there and overpowering the strength of the stud set into the case. So you can see some of these, the nylock has actually threaded the stud farther in the case, and some of it has stayed right where it needs to stay. So what I'm going to do here in this case, I'm going to take this one here, I'm going to use that one as my gauge, try and back that nut off of there without backing out the stud. We're going to mark it so we know where it is. Pull all these studs out of here, clean them, reset them, Loctite them, run it back in there. I'm going to let the Loctite cure 24 hours, and then I'm going to go back in there and we're going to start again and see how we end up. Okay, so I like this one here. Just mark that one at 12 o'clock. With a little oil under the nut. Set it nylocks. Okay, so while our studs are drying, let's take a look and see what's going on with these chain ramps and what the problem is. So here's a chain ramp that I've already tried to install on our cam box studs, and I've put 2 of these on and 2 of them have broken. You can see the clips broken away there. And before we break them, this is pretty much what they look like. Just 2 plastic tabs. It's a real rigid plastic. These ones are genuine Porsche, and I even tried buying some aftermarket just to see if maybe there's some subtle differences. Might be a little more promising for us, but real similar in design and quality, so I really don't see any advantages there. So what the problem is, I think, is the rigid material plastic is good for a chain guide, but it's no good for this design here. It really is not a good design. Taking a look inside here, so these are the plastic nibs that are supposed to lock in on the retaining groove in the studs or the bolts, and that's kind of the principle in how they work. The problem is this plastic is so rigid that by the time you flex this out of the way for the nib to get over the stud or the bolt, you end up with a stress crack right here and they break. And that's the problem I'm having. I even tried lubricating. Let's take a look at our stud configuration in our chain box. So you can see the point of entry as it would ramp up over that nib is quite severe. And that might actually be what the problem is for here. The idea is that those nibs drop down into here, but by the time it flexes that tab and gets over this edge, bam, it breaks right there. These are our bolts. They have a lot more severe approach angle, which I think it will be more beneficial, but I don't know, based on the diameter of the shaft, that it's enough to prevent any kind of stress cracks. So I'm putting grease on there. I've greased those. Even with grease, it still broke. What my plan is to heat them up in the oven to 120 degrees, warm them up so that they're not rigid and brittle. And then just gently try to massage that guy back in there with some grease. If we have some success with our bolts versus our studs here, then when I get to our chain boxes, I think what I'll do is I'll just grind down an angle on here so we have a better approach angle for the nibs to drop in, and then that should help that. So this is the original design that they used back in the day, and this is really a superior design to the modern cheaper knockoff of the original. I like the way it locks in a lot better. It's a lot more heavy duty. The problem with these is the material that they vulcanize is not as durable as a plastic glide, so I guess that's why they went to that. But this design right here, this is terrible. These came out of the chain boxes. They're like a flexible rubber. There's no nibs inside of this design. But these were in the chain boxes when I pulled them off the car, and these were just sitting on the post, so no nibs to lock them in. They just were kind of floating in their design, and maybe with this design it's fine for the chain box, because if we slip them over and put them on, but they were just pressed on there. It was a press fit. That's how they did it. This might have been some aftermarket design, who knows, but not a bad design. I like them, but unfortunately we can't go with those. And then I printed out a page from the manual here, so this is going to be the configuration. The long end of the ramp is going to face inward towards the center of the engine. This is the right side, left side, and the brown is going to be on the lower right. Alright, so shop temperature, just a little bit cool in here. That's mainly why I want to warm them up, just to make them a little bit more supple. I think that's going to give us an advantage. Let's go ahead and get those warmed up, drop them in from the top side, and see what's going on. Okay, temperature's dropping fast, so 100 degrees is still better than 65. Let's give it a try. And the lower stud, or the lower bolt, is the one with the nib, so we'll screw this one in first. Okay, using a pry bar then to just keep a little pressure on the inside. Okay, so just getting a little bit better angle at it just to see what's going on inside here. So I pulled that top bolt out, which is the one without the nibs, and you can see down inside there that it's centered. Got it nice and tight in there, and it's definitely on the groove. So the grease helped. I think the temperature helped us a little bit, and we're not going to have any issues with that. Okay, so then the second one here, I think I'm going to put the bolt in the rear end first so that I can see and feel as it locks in. You can see the tabs open up. There's no stress cracks. Okay, so we got through that one successfully. Real touch and go. I just don't like the design on these guide rails at all. If one of those tabs were to break off or drop in the engine at a later date, you'd have that thing traveling through your engine, and that would definitely not be good. So this is just one of those things. Go slow, check and verify everything before you seal it up. Make sure you know everything's where it's got to be and you don't have any stress cracks. And then our second side here, this went pretty good also. You can see down in there, everything looks to be okay. And again, you want to make sure your chain is not binding on anything. Everything is where it's supposed to be. And for some reason my camera didn't want to focus here. But the main takeaway here, guys, is verify, verify, verify. Get a flashlight down in there and make sure you don't have any cracks. Alright, let's move on to our sump cover. We'll go ahead and install this one more time, and hopefully our Loctite is going to hold those guys in place. And then we're going to go with another new set of nylocks. So nylocks, when you run these guys in, they have a resistance to them. And this, even if it wasn't a nylock, would be a relatively low torque spec, somewhere between 8 and 11 pounds is what I found. But I'm not going to use a torque spec. When I tighten these down, I'm going to use a small socket, and I want to feel as I'm running in the nylock, how tight does it feel. If I put a torque wrench on there, I'm not going to be able to feel that. I don't know that the reading I would be getting out of my torque wrench on my nylock would be accurate anyway. Alright, so this time around you can see all our studs are right where they should be. They're protruding just past the face of the nut there, and no movement whatsoever. And our nylocks are nice and snug on there. I don't know what a torque would be for that. I would trust the feel of a socket and a wrench than a torque gauge on those for actual sealing this surface right here. So this one is 42 Newton meters. I'm just putting a little bit of grease on the threads there. This has been replated. I've got a new aluminum sealing ring, which came with our Victor Reintz gasket set. Alright, and then on part 2 we're going to finish up the crankcase trim. This is going to be the last little bits and pieces that I'm going to put on here to trim this guy out. That's going to pretty much do it before we move on to pistons and cylinders. Well, thanks for watching, and we'll see you on part 2.